Hi, everybody. Welcome back for week 3. We are starting our first specific revolution, which is going to be the American Revolution, and we are looking at the British Empire and its effects on the American colonists. Obviously, it's the revolution that we tend to know the most about. Probably the vast majority of us in the class, right, um, are American, took American history, so we usually know the general trajectory of the American Revolution. But since we're looking at this from an Atlantic world perspective, and that's kind of how we're focusing the entire course, we want to look at the American Revolution from this particular angle as we go through this week. So, when we're looking at this revolution as well as other revolutions throughout the rest of the semester, we're looking at some key questions, right? The specific sort of conditions that create the revolution that we're covering in a given week. So there will be, as we build on week after week after week, some key sort of common themes that will come back to us again and again. And then there are some really key specific things that we want to make sure we keep in mind for why the revolution evolves in the way that it does and why it has the end result that it does. So if you've looked at the module assignment, one of these key questions is essentially what you're covering in the module assignment. And this is something that you're making an argument on, right? In terms of to the degree that we consider this to actually be a revolutionary effort. We are looking at, right, all of the conditions of what the colonies look like prior to revolution, what they are attempting to achieve in the process of revolution, and then what the end result of the revolution is. So if we're looking at this specific revolution, which we tend to know quite a bit about, right, and we're looking at it from this Atlantic world sort of angle, right, we've got two things going on. We've got the international conditions, colonial conditions of the mother country colonial relations, the mercantilist system that exists at the time, which is true for the American colonies as it is for other colonies throughout the Americas at this time. But of course, there are particular conditions of being a British colony versus, say, a French colony or a Spanish colony. And then we are also in the Age of Enlightenment, right, which we also established in week 2. When we're looking at this question of what people are fighting for, and something I want to emphasize for us as we think about what's going on this week, it's something that will return in later weeks when we're looking at other countries and other peoples who are upset about the governing systems under which they live. For the colonists, we tend to emphasize, right, this phrase, no taxation without representation. The key issue, and Klooster emphasizes this in the chapter, but I know these chapters, right, they're fairly long. You've got other sources to look at. So when you go through the chapter, you do want to sort of hone in on this sort of moment, right, which is when he's talking about taxation, the key issue for colonists is not taxes themselves. They are not necessarily interested in completely abolishing taxation in the colonies. They are, first and foremost, concerned about the level of representation they have that is making decisions about the degree to which they're being taxed in the colonies, right? And the argument by the mother country is going to be tied to this, idea that you have is sort of indirect representation, right? Which is not enough for the colonists, especially when they feel like they're being disproportionately impacted by these taxation measures. When we're looking at its success, since we don't have anything to compare it to at this point, right, what do we consider to be success is a key component of understanding what we consider successful, right? So there is, in terms of if you're looking at it solely from the perspective of we've overthrown an older system of governance and created a new one, right, then we consider the American Revolution to be successful if it is less chaotic, right, in the long term than some of these other revolutions that we'll look at, and more stable, then you could say it was successful. But this is where we're getting, do we consider this a full revolution or not? Are we overthrowing the actual ruling order? Not really, right? We've still got this upper class of people who are essentially controlling the system, that are, very intricately involved in the formation of the new country. If we look at some of the sources that you'll look at this week also, when we consider the public and who is included in the public that benefits from the revolution and benefits from these Enlightenment ideals, it's a pretty small percentage of the population, right? So something else to keep in mind when you're thinking about these questions. In terms of how these things are, right, spread continued throughout this time period. We're focusing on a couple different themes. One, how do you get such a widespread sort of interest and public support for the revolution itself? Do you make conditions as such where it becomes very difficult for people to push back against this? And it's again something we'll come back to when we look at, say, the French Revolution or the Haitian Revolution, how these sorts of ideas continue to play out in terms of why you would support this, what are the tangible reasons for support versus maybe the intangibles, like ideological reasons for why you would be really interested in a patriotic effort, right? And then, of course, from our Atlantic world perspective, to the degree in which international forces, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, all of these different groups of people play a role in the ultimate success on the ground in terms of what's happening in the revolution. Since we're looking at the American Revolution solely, but we will come back to kind of comparing other revolutions to the American Revolution over time, right? One of the things that I wanted to emphasize, and Klooster will do this as well as some other sources, but just in terms of giving you a sense of what to focus in on here, right? America as an entity, right? The colonies are pretty stable financially. It is a middle class world, we could say, for the time period. And basically, what we mean is the standard of living is very high. Some scholars essentially say that the standard of living in the colonies is higher than pretty much anywhere else in the world at this time. So even when they're struggling with recession or economic instability or concern about taxation, the degree to which you could build a certain standard of life for yourself and your family was much higher than many other places, right? So this kind of pushes back, if you remember from week 2, of that, there has to be clearly like this really, really high degree of economic unrest or poverty, right? Or suffering. We're also, of course, looking at both the tangible and intangible components of what helps make the revolution possible. It's how we take certain ideas that are percolating at the time, right? All of these Enlightenment concepts that we covered in week 2, we're continuing on that in week 3. A lot of times we'll focus on something like Thomas Jefferson, right, in the Declaration of Independence, which is mentioned a bit in the sources, but we're honing in on Thomas Paine, for the purposes of this week, and how these ideas are communicated to a public audience. Paine isn't necessarily saying anything new, right? But it's the way in which he's presenting them to the public that makes it so invigorating, right? And then finally, the mercantilist system, the style of colonial governance. Klooster covers this quite a bit in terms of how it evolves over time for the colonists, but I put this, little political cartoon in here just to remind you. Usually cover this in like a survey American history class, right? But generally speaking, this is true for the American Revolution and the other colonial revolutions that we'll see in this time period. Colonists are pushing back against this system that essentially forces them to always be in service to the mother country's needs, right? Whether that's all of the ways in which they're being taxed. That's one of many components in how the mercantilist system operates to benefit the mother country, right? Extraction of resources, trade systems, basically creating closed market systems so that anything that you sell from your colonial entity, right, has to go to the mother country at rates that are favorable to the mother country. And then in exchange, you're forced to purchase things from the mother country, right, that are being taxed at a rate that's beneficial to them. Klooster talks about tea, for example, right, being a great example of a way in which the mother country, England, right, in this case, is creating a monopoly on the tea, this tea industry, because they can't sell these things in the mother country, right? So all of the ways in which it's explicitly and implicitly kind of built into the system in which you're serving these entities. And this is where we get, right, some of the upper classes being so invested in trying to undo this system that makes us, essentially in service to the larger sort of colonial enterprise. If you wanted, you're interested in some of the specific documents that give you a sense of how we start to include all of the ideas that later end up in our own Constitution and the initial amendments to the Constitution. Teaching American History has a pretty good chart on this, and you could actually, I think, if you look some of these up, you would get a sense of the terminology that's used, right? But this is also true. We're talking about the history of the English and English citizens, right? A recognition of certain rights and concepts of rights that play a role in terms of how these citizens feel like they should be treated as we get closer and closer to a point of revolution. When we're looking at why the revolution ends up being successful, right? You have to have this component of mass mobilization, which we talked about in week 2, the first lecture, right? What are all the sort of components that are necessary for a successful revolutionary effort? We have a bringing together of commoners and elites. So you want to focus on in the readings how this is made possible. And it's, up to your interpretation as you read these sources. Are you more convinced by an idea? In the discussion board post is going to ask you this, of really tangible reasons for why people are really focused on the idea of revolution, or is it really these ideological reasons that you're more convinced by this idea of freedom and liberty and representation in government and things of that nature? So in terms of how we're thinking about this question of liberty, right? The way in which ideas are developed, we won't really talk about this or see this in the sources much, but we can get a sense when we look at something like Thomas Paine and the information that's presented to the public, especially because sometimes we can think we're in an age of enlightenment and reason, that this is the dominant sort of force in American life at the time, which is fundamentally untrue, right? This is a period in which we're having this massive wave of religious revivalism, which will happen in the decades leading up to the revolution and will happen for decades after the revolution is over. And so there's already been quite a bit of pushback within the colonies against older institutional authority within the church. And so there is scholarship that really hones in on this idea that because we had already kind of pushed back against some of these institutions, we were equipped and ready to push back against our governing institution in the secular arena as well, which is an interesting concept to consider. We can think about even some of the terminology that Paine uses in documents like Common Sense, kind of drawing off of the verbiage used in revivalist sermons, for example. So it's an interesting thing to consider when we're thinking about other sort of contexts that could have played a role in how the revolution evolves, right? When you look at the British Empire also, right, keep in mind what's different about the British Empire, what's unique about them as we kind of get into some of these other empires, specifically the French and the Spanish, right, as we look at other revolutions going forward. So the big sort of, overarching questions that we're thinking about for the American Revolution, of which you should focus your reading and also should be clearly present in both the discussion board post and the Module 1 assignment, right, was firstly, do we consider this to be revolutionary or not? That's the big question that we're trying to ask ourselves. And it is up to you taking these sources, right, through discussion with your peers to come up with a argument based off of the evidence that we have through weeks 2 and 3 to the degree that you feel that to be true and why or why not, right? Who is actually revolutionary in this system, especially as you look at some of the sources regarding gender, race, class, right? What sort of is going on in terms of these mobs, right? Or this mob mentality versus the elites who are trying to create a specific system that maybe is not what the commoners had in mind at the point of the revolution happening, right? So we get to something like in this particular picture, post-revolution, Shays Rebellion, the creation of a federalist system in the Constitution, which is very clearly not going to give a whole lot of power to the common voter, right? This is why at the time in which we're looking at the early republic, there's no person in the federal system who is directly elected by the public other than your representative in the House of Representatives, which is essentially the least powerful elected official, right? Senators at this time, not elected by the public. The president, as we know, elected through the Electoral College, right? And even that didn't really function the same way that we see it functioning today. We didn't really have a primary system like we are currently using. We didn't have a convention, so all of these things that are in place at the point of the early republic are very different even from what we see in the present. And so when we're looking at what are the systems that actually come into place when everything is said and done, right, that gives us a sense of how revolutionary we think these revolutions are, and then how we're going to see, right, these themes as we move forward. I'm going to end really quickly by talking a little bit more about Module 1 assignment, giving you a guide here. You know what the main question is. I just talked about it, right? We know we've only covered American Revolution. You can use sources from weeks 2 and 3, which is what we've covered to this point. We're thinking about it in the context of the Age of Revolutions, but it's not something that you will really get a whole lot of opportunity to really expand on at this point, although to the extent that you want to talk about, say, Enlightenment ideals in your answer, or any sort of international role in the American Revolution, you certainly are welcome to do so, but you are making your argument based off of the evidence that you find most convincing. As you go through this, the assignment will tell you certain things that I want to see and certain things I don't want to see in the assignment. So you want to make sure you know what these things are so you don't have a big mishap, right, as you're working. This is a formal assignment. All 3 of the module assignments are worth a decent amount of points. As you can see in the syllabus, they're each 240 points. So they are decently long, around 1,200 words. Please don't go over 1,500. You want to make sure that there is an argument. So you should have a thesis statement that makes an argument. If you have ever struggled with writing thesis statements or you're not exactly sure how to go about doing that, please email me. I will definitely give you feedback if I see that there's something wrong in your thesis statement after Module 1, but it should be making an argument, right? Secondly, you want to make sure you have citations both in the text using footnote style citations and a bibliography at the end that lists the sources that you're using. They are all going to be in-class sources. Please don't use anything from outside of the classroom unless you are going to draw. The only exception I'm going to give you, say you want to use the Constitution, a primary source that clearly we all know, or the Bill of Rights, you are welcome to do that. But that's really the only point in which I'm going to allow you to use outside sources. If you're using all in-class sources, you want to make sure that you're not only using Klooster. You want to draw from a variety of sources. That doesn't mean you have to use every single source that we've covered in these 2 weeks. Certainly by the time we get to Module 3 assignment, I don't expect you to use every single source in the classroom, but you want to choose a variety of sources to draw from to help you come up with your argument. If there's ever, we're looking at, say, podcasts over the course of these few weeks in this course. Obviously, you can't do anything like a page number. So if you look up, I think, citation information for a podcast, sometimes they tell you to, let's say the time frame or something in which something was said. I'm not super concerned about that. I've listened to the podcast. I know the material. If you just list that this is information that's coming from the podcast, that's totally fine with me. And there won't be, any additional sort of like page number type citation in there, but that's fine. Keep in mind, you don't want to forget these things as we move forward into the other modules. So keep your notes. Continue to think about the American Revolution as we transition into French revolutions and Spanish revolutions, what similar contextual factors are affecting all of these revolutions. Are you convinced by an argument that this truly is an age of revolutions in which we can kind of put these things together, should be thinking of them in that sort of intellectual context, or are you not, which is totally fine as we go through the semester, but you definitely want to think about all the things that are binding them, all of the things that are making them very different, or why they end in the way that they do. It's all tied back, right, to these contexts, to these goals, to these people who are involved in them, right, all of the active sort of components of history and how history is made. So on that note, I will leave us off here. I will see you next week when we get into Module 2 and talk about the French revolutions.